You ready? You were right. The answer's outside the box. Like, the point is that we all think in paradigms. We all think in boxes. And when we're asked to connect all the dots, we immediately assume that the border, we assume that the border of the solution is the edge of the dots. Because intuitively and instinctively, we think in paradigms. We think in systems. We think in patterns. Here's the solution again. 9 dots. The solution is to think outside the box. The solution is to come down outside the box completely. Outside the box completely. Across and then down. The point is, let me go back here to the title. The point is on the title that paradigms define the way we think. Even when the solution is outside the paradigm. It's just how we are wired. This is, I think, the last slide in this first part. Paradigms are actually like the frames of glasses. Our minds see through lenses that are shaped and held in place by paradigm. If you think about the farmer, 2 of them each being asked to move 1,600 bushels, they looked at what they were being presented with through lenses that were shaped by paradigms. Paradigms operate at an unconscious level. When they're operating, it's unconscious. It's not that we're sitting there measuring something like we would with a tape measure. They're unconscious, yet they determine what we think we see. And especially what we believe our options to be. And that means whether we like it or not, or even if we realize it or not, our future will be shaped by the paradigms that we embrace today. I snagged this picture, but these are glasses, but just imagine this is the paradigm. And we're each like this. We each look through this fixed pattern of seeing things. And that's what determines what we see. Remember, you were looking at 9 dots. The answer was right in front of you. And the reason we don't see it is because we assume patterns that are assumed. We assume that the borders are the edges. That's the section on paradigms. I don't know if any of you want to stop and talk about this before we go on or contend with anything. Or is it hot in here? Stuff is not hot, just stuff.
Kevin, looking at that from a constituency association perspective, we always understood there's 2 ways to make a shift paradigm, either by knowledge or learning, or a catalyst event, like you're talking about the movie, would be one event that shifted everyone's thinking all at once.
Yep.
And that's not usually what happens. It's usually when we're trying to run an election campaign, you know, we have our own supporters, we're not looking at them to change their minds, they're already going to vote for us. It's the ones that aren't voting for us, how do we change their perspective and their paradigm to see our perspective to get them to vote our way.
We're thinking outside the box. And this whole next section.
So that would be the learning and the knowledge part. But
well, the question becomes, how is a paradigm shaped?
well, and the other thing is, isn't there a risk that if you open your perspective too far, you also increase your vulnerability, where you're giving all your ideas to your opposition as well?
Well,
So once you open the perspective, then it opens everybody.
yeah, you're raising some really good points. Let me throw out this idea. Mostly what political parties and those that are involved in politics do is they contend on one side the consequences of a paradigm against the consequences of somebody else's paradigm. In other words, you see the policy issues the way you do as a result of the way you look. Your perspective, your paradigm shapes what you see. And the other guy on the other side is exactly the same thing. The appropriate question to ask then is, how is a paradigm shaped? Like what, instead of objecting to the paradigm that belongs to our opponent, which is understandable, let's ask the question, what is the foundation that policy that we find objectionable rests upon? And where did that foundation come from? The foundation is obviously a paradigm, but the question becomes, where did it come from? How did it get there? Who made it? What were the factors that shaped it? Because unless you know that, unless I know that, what you're doing is you're actually chasing the consequences of things rather than the cause of things. And any of us who've been around farms or gardens for very long know that if you rip out a weed and don't get to the root of it, it's just going to grow. You can even pull it off at the ground level. But it'll be right back in no time at all. We will answer your question. Paradigms are shaped by power.
Just, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with a paradigm that has no reason for why it happened? I.e., Jack Layton, Orange Movement, winning virtually all of Quebec with candidates who didn't even show up to campaign. So that's a paradigm shift of how to run a campaign, but would that work over and over again?
We will, like, you're raising excellent questions. My concern is, if you'd allow me to go through this one next section, not to ignore anything that's going to be raised, because the points that you're raising are the ones that actually need to be discussed. And the purpose of the presentation is to attempt to create a context within which that discussion can actually occur. So that when it does happen, instead of all of us looking at what's going on through a policy-only perspective, most people involved in politics think you're involved in a war of ideas. The bottom line of this presentation is that you're not. Even though you think you are, you're not. What you're actually involved in is a competition in communication and strategy and resource development. That's what you're actually doing. And if you assume that you're involved in a war of ideas, you are imposing limitations upon yourself. You're forcing yourself to look through a narrow perspective. You won't be able to see the other options. We will come to your, what's your first name again? I'm sorry?
Doug.
Doug? We will come to that, Doug. But before we go there, let's ask our, elections are all about power. I mean, any one of us living in Western society, I doubt that any of us can get through a week without either being involved in a discussion or overhearing a discussion where the subject of power is mentioned. And every time it comes up, most of us assume that we know what that word means. We just assume we know what it means. But the question is, do we? Do we actually know what it means? What does it mean? We just assume we do. Most people are interested in power, especially political power. In fact, every time somebody casts a ballot in an election, they're actually engaging in an act that is associated with power. Even though most people might not want to say that or admit that, that's actually what they're doing. On the basis of your current paradigm, what would you say power actually is? Imagine you're a farmer. Some of you here are farmers, some of you are not, but imagine you are. And we just asked you to haul 1,600 bushels of grain. Where does your mind go? Are you thinking of a wagon or are you thinking of a tandem with 30 wheels and a diesel engine and an air-conditioned cab? Where's your mind go? And remember, this has absolutely nothing to do with how smart anybody is. This has nothing to do with how smart anybody is. This has only to do with how we see and what we see. So here's the question. If you were asked to stand in front of a small group of people, even here tonight, if we were each individually asked to stand in front of the group and explain what power is, what would you say? We know that political parties compete for power and that business leaders and executives in blue chip corporations have power. We even use the language of royalty to describe some of them. How many of us have heard the phrase that so-and-so is a media baron? So-and-so is an oil baron. He's a ruler of a corporate empire. We assign the language of royalty to power without even thinking about what that might mean. Most of us. We also know that various power sources compete and clash with one another. They include political parties, governments, newspaper publishers, lobby groups, social activists, environmentalists, and labor unions, but even terrorists and schoolyard bullies are concerned with the application of power. This is what the students of power have said power actually is. Max Weber has been dead now for about 90 years. He was the founder of the modern study of sociology. Brilliant man. He defined power as the possibility of imposing one's will upon the behavior of other people or persons. Canadian academic and renowned scholar John Kenneth Galbraith, who was actually a farmer from Ontario that ended up in the United States and a well-known professor at Harvard, he said this. He made reference to Weber's definition, and he said, this almost certainly is the common perception of power. Someone or some group is imposing its will and purpose or purposes on others, including on those people who are reluctant, that are not interested in submitting to it. And then he went on to say this, unmentioned in nearly all references to power is the highly interesting question as to how the will is imposed and how the acquiescence or the submission of other people is achieved. How does that work? And if we did know how that worked, would that explain to us what shapes paradigms? And that leads us to inquire about the source of power. We know that everything else has a source. Rivers come from glaciers and springs. That picture on the right is actually Bow Falls, just out of Lake Louise. That's the source of the Bow River. That's where it comes from. Oxygen comes from photosynthesis. That's its source. Oil and gas comes from plankton. If we go online or purchase a book about the source of oil and gas, it's plankton. Galbraith, who was considered an authority on the subject of power and on many other things, the man actually was the recipient of 50 honorary degrees, and he wrote almost 50 books, including his classic Anatomy of Power. If any of you get the chance to read that book, you might find it interesting. It's called The Anatomy of Power, and it's his thesis after thinking about it for decades as to what power is, how power works, and how it's applied. He suggested in his book that power is derived from three sources and expressed by three different levers. We just saw where the rivers come from, and oxygen, oil, and gas. Galbraith pointed out that power comes from three different sources, and that each source has to be carried or presented or leveraged in a certain way in order for it to be effective. The first source of power is personality. How many of us in this room have met somebody that you're just with that person and you just say, boy, that guy's got power? How do you describe it? You don't even know. You just know personality. Personality is the first of the three sources of power. Property is the second. And in this context, property just doesn't mean real estate. It means cash and any other asset that can be liquid that you can convert to cash. That's the first two sources of power. Personality, property. The third source of power is organization. And it doesn't matter if you're a government or the mafia. If you want to create a foundation upon which to leverage your power, you have to create an organization. It's the way it works. We'll get into that more in a minute. Each of these three sources has a conduit or a carrier. The source is just by itself, but unless you have something that moves the source from A to B, the source is not effective. It's like having a bunch of farm chemicals in your shed. It has the power to exterminate weeds or kill whatever you need killing in a field. But if you don't have a way to move it from inside that shed to where it needs to go, how much power is contained inside a can of Roundup or Aminex or something else. I don't even know if they use Aminex anymore. But unless you have some means to transport it and deliver it. The three levers of application are the capacity to reward. If you can reward someone, you have a power lever. We'll get into this more in a minute. If you can punish someone, you have a lever. The mafia is an organization. If they punish you, the organization is expressing the leverage. If you're a government, you're an organization. If you're driving too fast, as I understand a few people in here do on occasion, the capacity that the government has to punish you is the leverage of the power of government. If they couldn't punish you, the government wouldn't have any power over you. The capacity to punish is the lever. The third lever of power is the capacity to change, shape, or define beliefs. In my opinion, this is the most significant lever there is. If you can change, shape, or define what someone believes about virtually anything, you're actually imposing your will upon that person, even though that person may not know it. Each power source works in conjunction with one or more. Some of the sources actually can access two or even all three levers at the same time. The levers are the delivery mechanisms. Now we looked at the three sources. Let's ask ourselves, okay, the same question Galbraith asked. How do people submit? How do we submit to power? If somebody else is imposing their will upon us, how do we submit to that? Or how does somebody get someone else to submit? The free market, this is the lever of rewards. It's the capacity to offer you something. If you work for someone and they offer you a better paycheck, better perks, a company car, a pension plan, you can go through, the list is long. They're offering you a reward. The employer is engaging you by offering you a reward, and every time we submit to that lever of power, it's a conscious act. It's always a conscious act. We always know we're submitting to it. When I change jobs and I go to work for Cargill, when I change jobs and go to work for Enbridge because they're offering me more money, it's a conscious act. I know exactly what I'm doing. And the truth is that whether we want to admit it or not, I'm submitting to a power lever that Enbridge is pulling on, or Cargill is pulling on. It's not coercive. Don't misunderstand me. Just because we're exercising power doesn't mean we're bullies. It doesn't mean we're coercing someone. The second lever is that of punishment, and here too, the submission is always a conscious act. When we stop speeding because we're afraid of losing our license, of being punished by losing our license, it's a conscious act. For a lot of people, the reason they don't rob banks is because they're afraid of the punishment. Not that they wouldn't rob banks if they'd given the chance and knew they could get away. So it's the punishment that stops them. Schoolyard bullies have power for this very reason as well. Punishment. They'll punish you. Submission is conscious. The ability to change, shape, or define beliefs, submission to this lever is almost always unconscious. For example, most of us in here, all of us in here, there are certain brand name products that we buy when we go to supermarkets, when we go to Safeway, or when we go to wherever we go to buy stuff. And it doesn't matter if we're buying soda, pop, or if we're buying shampoo, or if we're buying cornflakes or cereal or whatever we're buying. There are many things that in our society we buy because our attitude and belief toward that product has been shaped by somebody. The reason Procter & Gamble is the world's largest advertiser, spending somewhere in the vicinity, this is a guess, so don't take this to the bank, but I think the number is around $6 billion a year. This is just one employer. This is not total advertising. Some of these guys are spending vast sums of money. McDonald's. Let's ask the question, well, why? What is it they're doing? Why would any for-profit corporation take billions of dollars and sock it into something where there doesn't appear to be any immediate or measurable return? Why are they doing it? The reason they're doing it is because when Mildred Beasley walks into Safeway to buy a box of Tide because she thinks it's going to do something for her, Mildred doesn't connect the fact that her attitude toward tithe was shaped by the company that manufactures the tithe. The company hired communications people. The company went through the process of affecting how Mildred thinks and believes and how her attitude was shaped toward that product. Mildred doesn't know that. It's the same whether you're buying Diet Pepsi. Our daughter and son-in-law live in North Carolina, and they have 3 kids. And they just moved. They never had a TV until about a month ago, and the youngest one is 5 or 6 years old. Now that they got a TV, every time a commercial comes on, Sarah is her name, she's making a list of all the things she wants for Christmas. Well, I mean, it's a little kid, and it's a television. But the principle is sound. Power sources and delivery levers. The power source, personality. That's the source, personality. The primary lever of expression of this power source, not the only one, but the primary one, is the ability to change shape or define beliefs. The picture on the left and the bottom is Demosthenes. Some of you may know who he is. He is considered to have been one of the most eloquent speakers in history. He was an Athenian, a very, very brilliant orator. He used to spend time practicing fluid hand motions in front of the mirror, knowing that the way he moved his hands when he spoke to people would have an impact upon them. He lived in an era prior to the invention of electronic sound, so when it was stormy out by the water, he used to go out and stand on a rock and expound against the waves in order to expand his voice and his lungs. He used to practice speaking with pebbles in his mouth. And he ran mile upon mile upon mile with his mouth open, breathing deeply, in order to expand his lungs so that his capacity to engage in oration and move men and women would be enhanced. His objective wasn't to entertain people. His objective was to shape and influence what people believed about the things he was talking about, because he knew that was power. Even though a lot of people he might be speaking to didn't, or didn't perceive it as that. The second guy we all know, and whether we like him or not, or the third guy, all these guys in the bottom, they're all individuals about which, in some greater or lesser degree, we could say that whether we like him or not. The reason that Tommy Douglas, in the middle, carried his socialist mandate as broadly and as farly, is that a word?
It is now.
It is tonight.
Dave Nelson's going to say that's a word tonight. Thank you. But the reason that Tommy Douglas was able to carry his message the way he did is Tommy was a skilled orator. If you look at his background, what he did in university and high school, he was the captain of a debating team. He understood the concept of communication and the delivery of communication. And Douglas was able to persuade people, not on the basis of his arguments. Many people grew to support Douglas not because his policies were sound. They liked him because he was entertaining. They liked him because of the way he said things. They liked him because they had an affinity for his person, even though the policies might have been crazy. René Lévesque didn't get as far as he could have, but within Quebec, it's quite a study. You all know that that's William Aberhart on the right. We're going to talk more about him in a minute and the impact that he knowingly had on shaping the paradigm of Alberta. He was one of the early guys on the so-called political right who actually understood some of these concepts and employed them. On the top right is Bob Stanfield. I put him there in order to demonstrate that if politics really was a war of ideas and the best policies won, Bob Stanfield would have been the Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, isn't it true that not often the worst policies win? I mean, all you have to do is look at Trudeau and you can see that. He managed to rape $170 billion out of Western Canada in order to give the people of the East entitlement. And it's something that has carried on till today. And that's why we lost the last election. When people went to the polling booth, they looked is there an entitlement in here for me if I go Wild Rose?
Let me ask you a
And they
question.
said no, and they voted conservative. Well, not conservative, they voted PCs because there's no conservatism left.
Let's ask a question. Is the concept of an entitlement a policy or a paradigm? Is it the consequence of a paradigm, or is it a policy that stands alone all by itself? We're running into all these people who think that they have entitlements and the right to entitlements. Let's ask ourselves, why do they think that?
Was the entitlement the same as a reward?
We'll get to that.
No, Kevin, before you go off of that slide, the question earlier was about the MVP and Jack Layton. And, you know, I could almost see Jack Layton down on that list.
Oh, there's lots of them. In fact, Leighton was,
it was his personality that.
yeah, I
people
mean, a
wrapped
perfect
around.
example is Jesse Jackson.
You know,
Jesse Jackson is an eloquent man. Whether you like him or not, whether you think his policies are crazy or not, the fact is that Jesse Jackson is an eloquent man, and contained within him is the power of personality. And if Jackson finds himself in a place where he can access levers, and remember, the levers, or the sources, are personality, which he's got, organization, which is pretty easy to create, and property, which simply means that you need cash or some means to run the organization, and then you can employ all these levers. But we are going to get more into Leighton. Like, I promise you, we'll walk through this stuff up to our knees, and I hope we don't go too late. People who control property are in a position to reward those who comply with their wishes. This is not bribes we're talking about. Employees, suppliers, and service providers get paid to carry out the will of the person paying them. When you walk into McDonald's or the A&W and lay down some money, you are exercising this lever of power, whether you realize it or not. You're rewarding people. The guy that owns the business and the people who work there, you're rewarding them. And what they're doing is they're submitting to your will. You're saying, I want this. And they're saying, okay. And you give them money. And the transfer of the money is the lever that allows you to exercise your will over them. This is the reason the free market works. Is that if somebody doesn't give you within the free market what you need and want, you just go somewhere else to somebody who will. You say, I'm not going to reward you. I'm not going to give you any money. The truth is that the beauty of the free market, if you think of dollar bills as ballots instead of money, and that every time you spend one, you're voting for someone, then you begin to see how this whole thing works. Because everyone is not only a vote for somebody, it's a reward at the same time. You're saying, here, I like what you're doing, do it some more. I'm rewarding you. And people go, oh, those people, they like that when we do that. So you reward them some more. Property provides the men and women who control it with the means to extend their will and amplify the sound of their voice. Often this takes the shape of an individual or business, making property available to an individual, association, political organization, and so on, that will then engage one or more of the application levers that can express power. Could be personality, to change or define beliefs, facilitate organization, and so on. The guy who's done this as much or more than anyone, if any of you know who George Soros is, Soros is pouring big, big dough into this. He understands that he can actually empower. He's pulling levers of power. And there are other people with financial means that understand the same thing. But money all by itself won't do it. That's why it's dumb to give some money to some organizations. It's just flat out dumb. You can support the organization, but if they don't understand how the other levers work, you're going to waste your money anyway. Keep it. The third source of power is organization. It is harnessed by governments, public interest groups, and corporations of all kinds, including nonprofit organizations, member groups, labor unions. The only reason that a labor union is able to engage in the process of leveraging power is because it creates an organization which is the foundation or platform from which it works and does the things it does. Political parties are the same, various types of public or special interest groups. This bottom quote here, I think it's a quote from Adolf Burrow, who's also a guy who wrote extensively on power. He said, all power is invariably organized. All power. We're here tonight talking about power. We're talking about political power. We're talking about the power to shape paradigms. We're talking about power. Power is the capacity to extend the will. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, that's what it is. All power is invariably organized. Top power holders must work through existing organizations, perhaps extending or modifying them, or must at once create new organizations. There is no other way of exercising power. Here we are. I'll stop there. I don't know if we should take a break or whatever, but there's just one section left where we get into the answers and discussion of the points, good points, that you all have raised. And I'll end with this. Understanding paradigms. Remember, the paradigm is the way we see. Paradigm's not about how smart we are, it's about the way we see what we're looking at. And just because we see something doesn't mean we're seeing everything. Think of those two things that we were looking out two different ways. Understanding paradigms and the levers of power facilitates strategic planning. It allows you to develop schematics and strategic plans. You'll remember the very first slide we looked at. We talked about the fact that one of the challenges political parties face is that by perspective, and people who are politically active, by perspective, you write policy manuals instead of engineering schematics. You spend time thinking about policy manuals and how you're going to change it and add to it. I think it was you, Sam, who told me that the Progressive Conservative Party had how many pages were in it?
700 pages.
They had a policy manual at the time when the two parties merged. Their policy manual had 700 pages. That's the paradigm through which they view the world. If you talk to most people who are involved in politics, all they want to do is talk to you about policy, whether the budget's balanced, or some other policy, whether this is being spent right or that's being done right. And everybody assumes that's what politics is. That's the consequence of the paradigm. And I'll stop there. Mr. Chairman, should we take a 2-minute break or 3-minute break, a bathroom
Sure,
break?
we'll have a bit of a break.